Hello and welcome. Does the world's most powerful leader really have control over his own policies? The remarkable influence of those outside the government often goes unnoticed by the public, but there's a growing question over where the real power lies. In the early 1980s, Ronald Reagan came to the White House on a wave of anti-government sentiment. Having campaigned extensively against big government, he set out to shrink the federal bureaucracy by privatizing many of its functions. For the decades that followed, the downsize movement continued, so much so that by the time the US invaded Iraq, private companies had a greatly expanded role. It was no longer just those who took care of issues such as administration, building maintenance and supplies, but included those who were making strategic and critical decisions for the country. Many of these individuals were part of a complex web of influencers who advocated for America's entry into the war with Iraq and later shaped the occupation that followed. Well, now as the US grapples with its Iran policy, many wonder if it's these same characters pushing their personal agendas from behind the scenes once again. On today's show, we ask, is there a shadow elite, and who really runs Washington? Remember, you can join in the conversation with your questions and comments, and you can send an SMS or email, or we'll take your phone calls on the show as well. Joining me now to discuss this is Janine Waddell, a professor in the School of Public Policy at George Mason University. Dr. Waddell has just published Shadow Elite: How the World's New Power Brokers Undermine Democracy, Government and the Free Market. Also with me is Michael Lind, Policy Director of the New America Foundation's Economic Growth Program. In 2001, he co-authored The Radical Center, The Future of American Politics. I welcome you both to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Waddell, first question, I guess, the intriguing title of your book and this idea of a shadow elite. Who is the shadow elite?
Well, the shadow elite are the main players in this new system of power and influence that surfaced over the past 2 decades. As you point out, the United States has been contracting out parts of government for a very long time. But what's happened in the past 2 decades or so, really since the Clinton administration, is not only has the contracting out gotten really accelerated, but the rules have been changed. And there are a number of worldwide developments that have contributed to the rise of the shadow elite. So it's not just in the United States, but the players that I talk about in the book are people who are taking advantage of this new system, and they are what I call Flexians.
We're going to get onto that in just a second, but I do have to ask you this. There are a lot of fingers that were pointed in the Bush administration when it came to the lines blurring between those elected to power and those contracted to steer and guide government, so to speak. And I wonder how much has that changed under the new administration? President Obama came in saying he wanted to change things. You know, change was the key word.
Right.
How much has changed?
Well, here's the deal. 3/4 of people working for the U.S. federal government, 3/4 actually work for private companies. And it's not just in things like food service or gardening or photocopying, that sort of thing. It's actually, as you pointed out, in increasingly in what are called governmental functions. That is, they're actually helping to guide the policy agenda. For example, they choose other contractors, government contractors choose other contractors, they oversee other contractors, they are involved in crucial decisions. 1/4 of the intelligence workforce are actually contractors. So they are critically involved in the functions of government, and it's hard to see how that can be reversed overnight. The government is utterly dependent on contractors.
And I'm going to find out what these guys do in just a moment, but I want to bring in Michael Lind here and welcome you to the show, sir. And you know, think about the fact that these relationships exist everywhere, really. I mean, people do work with those they know. They employ the people, or they contract people across corporate function, everything else. People usually get people they know and trust and can relate to. So is that anything unusual? Is there anything really to be concerned about?
Well, I think Dr. Waddell has put her finger on a particularly unique system of the United States. You see some parallels in Russia and Eastern Europe, as she pointed out. I think there is a difference between the U.S. and Britain or France or Japan, where you have traditions of a strong, high civil service. We have a very weak bureaucracy in the United States. A lot of things that are done within the government in other Western democracies are outsourced here, and that includes a lot of legislative functions. A lot of the laws are written by lobbies. And so while you have influential elites in every system, you don't have the kind of outsourced contractor government that Dr. Waddell has described.
Is that a threat to democracy, though?
Well, I think it is. And Dr. Waddell has raised very good questions about what is the accountability here. When foreign policy is implemented by government diplomats or soldiers, there's a clear chain of command. It's not so clear when there are private contractors involved. And when you get the outsourcing of the actual making of the policy, of the decision making, then the question to who these people are accountable to becomes all the more grave.
Now, Dr. Waddell, this you know, obviously I want people to read the book to get a full idea of what you're talking about. But let's look at this term flexion that you use and four characteristics that you say that make someone a flexion. Now, we'll just go through these very briefly. I'll list them and then we'll look at them point by point. They personalize bureaucracy, they privatize information, juggle their roles, and relax regulation. So let's look at that. They personalize bureaucracy.
Well, a good example of that would be what I call the neocon core, which is really just not to be confused with a much wider array of ideological neoconservatives and the many thousands of people who call themselves neoconservatives. But just this is an interlocking network of about a dozen or so core players around Richard Pearl, and what they are known for is their anti-bureaucratic stance and modus operandi that they've developed. And this is also this is about a modus operandi. It's about a way of operating. So, for example, in the run-up to the war in Iraq, they were very effective with their people who were in government, both in the National Security Council and in the Pentagon, of creating a cross-agency clique, of creating their own procedures of bypassing the bureaucracy. So they bypass bureaucracy and do things informally through their own network.
We talk about America being a very free and open place in so many ways, though. So how do they privatize information?
Well, this particular group, and Flexians generally, it's important to understand that these are not people who cannot be reduced to the right or to the left, and it's not a conspiracy. This is a way of operating that's very, very effective, that lots of different groups do. Is this juggling
their roles? Is this what I mean by
well,
juggling their roles?
No, this
as well?
is privatizing information, but this particular group has been, the neocon core has been very effective in privatizing information over the years. Most recently, they were very effective in getting their alternative views of information, the information that they gathered, that Iraq posed a threat. They got that branded as official government information. So they set up several units in the Pentagon that would disperse that information to the media and throughout the government. So they try to get their views of information as the most authoritative official ones.
And juggling the roles presumably is being able to be flexible across different governments, different
parties. Absolutely across, and it's also individuals juggling roles, so that, for example, when Pearl is head of the Defense Policy Board, he can also he also has private might have private clients, and he has been alleged to be involved in delivering some of that information to private clients for their own purposes.
And relaxing regulations is basically about avoiding scrutiny, being able to bypass accountability.
Yes, and it's about being able to bypass the standard means of government, the standard processes and procedures through which things are done, and so that ultimately a new kind of system, new relationships between market and bureaucracy are created when these players are at the forefront.
Well, Michael, the people in power are supposed to be accountable in a democracy to the people who elected them. So is this, the lack of scrutiny by the public, or the lack of action to question this and make people accountable, is this basically the public getting the government they deserve?
Well, I think one of the ironies is that this growth of the shadow elite or shadow government contracting is in part a response to public attitudes. The American people want the government to do more, and at the same time they want it to be relatively small. So a lot of activities that are on the books in similar societies have been taken off the books, not only in foreign policy, where, for example, President Obama is sending, I saw today, nearly 60,000 more contractors. But that's not included in the official troop numbers. Fannie and Freddie, the government corporations behind the housing crisis, were removed from the books in the 1960s so that their liabilities would not show up in the federal debt. So I do think that the anti-government attitudes of Americans lead people of both parties, Republicans and Democrats, to try to disguise the actual scale and activities, and that has the unfortunate side effect that it creates this kind of shadowy world that Dr. Waddell describes.
Well, before we take a break, let me squeeze in quickly a quote from your book, Shadow Elite, Dr. Waddell, and this one where you talk about the media. Today's mainstream journalism has evolved in its acceptance and adoption of truthiness. Expertise or qualifications as a journalist are no longer essential. Even Karl Rove can become one. What role do you feel the media has played? This word truthiness was actually a sort of comical word that's been generated in the American media, referring to truth that people are comfortable with as opposed to facts and figures.
Right. Well, I think it does play a role, not just in the run-up to the Iraq War and not just in the last administration, but it's become part of our culture. And the idea is that something doesn't actually have to be true. The important thing is that enough people believe it. And people can have their own alternative universes because there's such a diversity of media. So this is a development that's been traced back to about 1995 that ties in with new media technologies and so on. And it's something that we as a culture, as a society, I think are really going to have to come to terms with, because it plays a great role here.
Well, I have questions for both of you still to come, but we're going to take a very short break here. Don't go away, we'll be right back.